I have to begin this article with one of my periodic confessions. I have very mixed feelings about the whole retro bike scene. To put it simply, I think that anyone who pays a premium for a pair of torn jeans, or a fake sweat-stained t-shirt, really has more money than sense. The same applies to fake classic bikes. Some classic machines were excellent. Even today, I have never ridden a more involving and satisfying bike than a matchless G.50, and if I never rode another machine other than a 1962 Triumph Trophy, I would be happy. However, most classic bikes were rubbish in their time, unreliable, difficult to start, and with predictably unpredictable handling and power which wouldn't excite a torpid hamster. To copy these bikes is just as silly as wearing a brand new t-shirt which has been synthetically aged. This is why I am reluctant to put the Moto Guzzi V7 into the retro bike segment, because, rather than being a parody of a classic motorcycle, it is a very, very fine modern motorcycle in its own right, and yet one which continues 94 years of motorcycle manufacturing heritage on the banks of Lake Como in northern Italy. Let's begin by looking at what makes a classic bike better than a modern machine, when on paper it should lose out on every front. The key, overwhelmingly important, factor is that the motorcycle must have an emotional link to the rider. This is where many retro bikes miss out. Adding complexity to a motorcycle does not automatically make it better, it just makes it more complex. There is no argument that if you have a 200 horsepower superbike cranked right over, and on the very limits of tire adhesion, you need traction control. There is a less valid, but still credible, argument for having different mapping options on your heavily laden AT machine as you ride from warm, dry roads into monsoon conditions. However, what the electronics do for most riders is to separate them from the very reason they ride in the first place, the pursuit of that unique link which comes only from a truly anthropomorphic bond between rider and motorcycle, the two-wheeled horse and living metal. The best, and only the very best, young designers understand this very subtle and nuanced idea, and when they produce a modern classic, it retains all the intense involvement of an original classic, but adds an electric starter and a lack of oil puddles on the garage floor. So, let's have a closer look at the V7. To an untrained eye, the transverse V-twin engine looks just like every other Guzzi which has used this car engine since 1967. However, in the last 48 years, things have moved on vastly. Yes, the engine does lie, uniquely amongst modern, mass-produced motorcycles, in a 90-degree V across the frame, and yes, it is air-cooled, but the 2015 manifestation of the concept is very modern, and comes with all the obligatory emission controls in the form of a catalytic converter and fuel injection. However, despite being compliant with all current, and predicted, legislation, Guzzi have done a very clever job in that the cat converter is completely inconspicuous, and the twin exhausts have a suitably classic growl to them. In fact, things are far better than this. If you are so inclined, you could creep round a Trappist monastery quadrangle and not disturb a monk's contemplation. Alternatively, you can have a lot of fun. Give the V7 a seriously sporting handful of throttle and the over square, 80mm x 94mm, 744cc V-twin has a really pleasant growl. It's not the angry Rottweiler of a lightly silenced Norton Commando, but certainly enough for a pleasure to give the impression that bureaucrats haven't stifled all the pleasure out of riding a retro bike. The engine itself is a lovely thing and is as effective as it is visually attractive. This is very much a motor to be seen, stroked and admired, and so it is important that the castings and machining are both impeccable, which they are. The power the V7 produces is very deceptive. Clearly, the V7 has to be compliant with European A2 license requirements, so it produces 48 horsepower at 6,500 RPM. A2 customers are on the way to an open motorcycle license, and they are vital to whole motorcycle industry in Europe. Get your A2 rider locked into your marquee and you can then ease him into the $20,000 Exotica when he has an open license. US and Canadian customers get an extra 2 metric horses via a modest remapping of the ECU. Now this doesn't sound like much fun, but it is because Guzzi have somehow managed to get peak torque at an incredibly low 3000 RPM. In practice, having this much pulling power available means that the V7 can be ridden like a scooter or, heaven forbid, a cruiser. Our test route took us up some serious hills surrounding Lake Como, and, carrying me and Carol, who was taking the images for this article, the V7 was a perfectly practical touring machine. Where it lost out was on top speed. I have no idea what is the V7's actual head buried in the tank maximum is, but I would be surprised if it is much north of 105 miles per hour. Returning to the Guzzi factory, I saw 95 miles per hour on the speedometer half a dozen times. At these speeds, the V7's aerodynamics, those of a porcine brick, start to demand power the bike clearly doesn't have. But here is the core of the matter. With ever-reducing, and more rigidly enforced, speed limits, 90 miles per hour is ample to get your license suspended, so at what point does top speed become merely a matter of geeky conjecture? For absolutely certain, I could drive the V7 hard all day to up, and stretch the tolerance of the law to the outer limits, with the existing 48 horsepower. However, a bit more urge would be nice, isn't it always? And, after the test was completed, we were gossiping to Guzzi's staff, and one mentioned that the factory does have a rather special V7 currently wandering around northern Italy. This engine knocks out 65 horsepower, with even more torque, and really would tick all the boxes. At the moment, Piaggio is spending a lot of money on the Guzzi brand, including reworking the ancient Mandello del Lario factory, so it clearly sees a future in the retro/quirky sector. A Super V7 would extend the V7 range very nicely indeed. Watch this space. Back to the present and the V7 gearbox and clutch. At one time, in the good, actually bad, old days, selecting a gear on a Guzzi was a real lucky dip affair. Yes, it was possible to get a Guzzi box working properly, but only with the efforts of a skilled tuner and a sensitive rider. By contrast, the 6-speed V7 had a thoroughly modern gearbox with sweet, effortless selection. I never once missed a gear, up or down, and that would have been an impossible thing to write even a few years ago. The 6-speeder, one more than last year's 5, might be considered overkill on a bike like the V7, but in the real world it isn't. The ratio spacing is now ideal in all conditions, from trickling through traffic to fast riding. The single-plate clutch is light and grab-free, and the shaft drive unobtrusive.